Hey everyone, it's Pittico from Daydream Nation, and I've got Angie Moon back to the channel. How are you?
Doing very well. How about you?
Not too bad, not too bad. Got Angie back to the channel so we could talk about one of her favorite bands and a band that we haven't discussed on this channel that probably needs a bit more recognition, the Kinks. So, Angie, I think, in my opinion, if you're going to talk about the big four of UK rock pop of the 60s, the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, you've got to include the Kinks.
Been listening to them ever since I was a teenager, thanks to the movie Pirate Radio, and then they had All Day and All the Night in the intro, and that just really rearranged my brain cells, that fuzzy guitar. Even though they weren't the first to do it, they did it just so well. Like, I think, it's been said that Americans invented rock and roll, but British people perfected it, and I definitely believe that to be the case. But when I really got into the Kinks, it was during lockdown, and I was working on a series of blog posts called Listen to This, Not That, where I go into basically just the less appreciated songs of each band instead of just doing greatest hits or whatever the classic rock stations play. I wanted to show that, hey, these bands have so much more to them than what you hear on the radio. So I did ones for the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who, and originally I was going to put the Kinks in a whole like British invasion compilation post. But then I found, wait, this material is so good, they need a post of their own. They need a dedicated post. And from there, I was like, okay, I can talk so much about the Kinks, and I found just so much to talk about.
Well, by the way, this show today, we are going to talk about Arthur, or the decline and fall of the British Empire. So this came out in 1969, Angie, and it wasn't successful, but critically acclaimed. But I think over time, people have realised that this is kind of a stone cold masterpiece. It's really the Davies at their very best. And listening to this album straight off the bat, I could hear a lot of modern bands like Blur and a lot of Britpop that has direct lineage back to the Kinks. And if there were no Kinks, half of Britpop wouldn't be around. That you wouldn't have this movement. You wouldn't have a lot of modern pop music. So everything's connected, and I think the Kinks need to be recognised. So this album, Arthur, when did you first listen to this, and what were your first impressions?
I think that was the first Kinks album that I put on my perfect albums list. So on my blog, and I've been keeping a perfect albums list ever since I was blogging on Tumblr. So this was before the WordPress days. So back in 2011, I started a Tumblr account, and I had a perfect albums list of albums that had no skips. Like, I could just listen to it full and no problem. And I think the Kinks Arthur was the first Kinks album I put on that list. And I think musically it's a better album than Village Green. However, I like the concept of Village Green a little bit better sometimes, but Arthur's still a great album. I think both of them, they were very much commercial flops, but critically and like musically, absolutely not a flop. Probably like amongst the greatest flops of all time, like Nick Drake's albums or John Martin's Solid Air, or I also like this one. I know that this is going to be a bit more obscure, but Welsh people might appreciate me mentioning this, is Mike Stevens' Outlander. That one's really, really good as well. He's very much kind of like the Donovan or Bob Dylan of Wales. Yeah, I definitely just love Arthur. I think that album is just so great. I also think that it also shows another side of the Kinks and how they get even deeper. And I think that really makes them stand out is, they weren't just doing Beatle type love songs. They were also talking about just deeper things in society and being, social and political commentators. I mean, they did that earlier with like Dead End Street and Sunny Afternoon. And you really, even Village Green Preservation Society has a bit of that, because it's kind of this, idea of being old fashioned, but not necessarily taking all the old fashioned values with you. And Arthur definitely, think to me, has just so many left-wing themes on it. And I definitely joke that this is just better theory than whatever Marxist theory I have to read, because this is more exciting. Like, this is more fun. I think it can definitely get normal people to really think about, the world in a different way. And I think it does show the power of rock and roll. Yeah,
Yeah.
like there's just so many socialist themes on the album Arthur. Like, there's anti-imperialist themes, anti-war themes, and anti-consumerist themes, themes about just class and mobility. Oh, a lot of that. I mean, it's really, really just thought-provoking. It's
Yeah,
incredible.
absolutely. And the lyrics are very much Davies as being a champion of the working class and doing all these little vignettes, kitchen sink dramas, which are their specialties, and they put social commentary wrap around like the kitchen sink drama. The lyrics on this album are great. How about we just tell the folks this is loosely a concept album? So a lot of people, when they think concept albums in the late 60s, they think of The Who and Tommy. Well, the Kinks were doing the same, but it flopped. So I think we've got to really champion and put a bit of a spotlight. So this
Oh yeah.
album, the plot is Arthur Morgan lives in a London suburb in a house called Shangri-La with a garden and a car and a wife called Rose and a son called Derek who's married to Liz. And they have these two very nice kids, Terry and Marilyn. Derek and Liz and Terry and Marilyn are immigrating to Australia. Arthur did have another son called Eddie. He was named after Arthur's brother who was killed in the Battle of Somme. Arthur's Eddie was killed too in Korea. And you've got basically 12 songs that tells the story. So why don't we go song by song and you just tell us your feelings and what you think about it. Let's start off with Victoria, which was a charting single, and it's probably the best known song off this album. What do you think of this one?
It's a hell of an opener, and interestingly enough, that wasn't the first version of Victoria that I'd ever heard. It was actually the Falls version that I heard, and I think one of the greatest things about the Kinks is that you can take any of their compositions. Ray Davies is just such a great composer that you can take any of his compositions and put them in any genre, and it just sounds natural. It just sounds like, oh, that's how it should have been sounding. Like, I remember watching a documentary of him, and he was just playing things and playing, he really got me in this bluesy, jazzy style, and it worked. And similarly, I think their music just translates so well to punk rock. I mean, they were definitely precursors. I will say that the Kinks walked so the Clash could run, 100%. But yeah, Victoria, that's where you hear the anti-imperialist themes at the end, where they go into all the places that the British have colonized. And yeah, I think it's just really interesting talking about the Victorian era. And I think one of my favorite things about Ray Davies is just his love of the old fashioned. I think it's just such a great, album opener. I definitely think it's just a great way to kick it off.
Yeah, it's a crack of an opening track, and he does have a love of music hall, like Paul McCartney. And the thing about music hall, to me, in my taste, sometimes it can be a little bit twee and go into the cheese. But with Ray Davies, he pulls it back on the right side of the ledger, that it sounds contemporary and it works as a piece of theatre, except one track, and I'll talk about that as we get deeper in. Look, the themes of this song are basically the working class adulation for royalty, Queen Victoria. So it's quite clever as it frames it into not contemporary about Queen Elizabeth, but going back in time to Queen Victoria, and maybe pointing a little bit of being a little bit critical of how everyone just instantly has that adulation for royalty. Another thing I've noticed is Ray Davies' voice. He plays a character. What do you think of that? When I first heard it, I thought, that's weird. He's kind of got a little bit half strangled voice, but he's playing a character. Do you like that, or how did you feel when you first heard that?
I didn't really think of it that way, but yeah, I think one of the things I do like about Ray Davies is that he's a pretty good actor. And honestly, he actually at around this time, I remember reading that he wanted to be in this socialist movie, but Dave didn't allow him to be in the movie. But yeah, and he did dabble a bit in acting, and I wish I could have seen him more in acting because I think people don't give him enough credit for being a good frontman and being a bit theatrical. Like, sure, he's not Freddie Mercury, he's not Robert Plant, but there's definitely some theatrics with Ray, and I just love his flamboyance. I love how he can just change his voice and play different characters. I think that's just brilliant.
Yeah, and I think we've got to let our viewers know the Davies are notoriously like that in real life, haven't they? There's something
They're
about
the Liam and Noel Gallagher of their day. Yeah.
Everly brothers. History's got a litany of all these brothers that just don't seem to
The
get on in
Fogartys.
bands. Yes, in bands. But another thing is the rock riff reminds me of a little bit of Canned Heat. It is a very bluesy type of
Going
rock
up the
riff.
country.
Yes.
Now I hear it. Yes. Yeah. Going up the country. I can hear that. And
Yeah.
speaking of Everly Brothers, later in the album, there is a bit of an Everly Brothers sound in one of the instrumental jams. And I just really love how they just dig into those kind of
Yep.
influences in the past. It's really great.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of folk think this is the best opening track in any Kinks album. Would you agree?
Yeah,
Perhaps? Yeah.
I'd say
Yep.
so. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Next song is Yes Sir, No Sir. This is a little bit of a playful song. What do you think of this? Bit of musical satire?
Yes, this is your anti-authoritarian track. Like, it's definitely, just talking about, people just being subservient and how easily propagandized people are. And I think it's definitely, you're seeing it again in history. You're seeing that again with like Trump and MAGA and everybody just kind of being minions for Elon Musk. It's really depressing to see. And it's just sad. Like people just forget about their class interests. And I can understand why Ray is just so frustrated with that. He's one of those working class people, one of the few that managed to move up to the upper class, move up to the upper echelons. And I'm glad that he didn't forget his roots and wrote this song. Now, granted, he didn't treat his bandmates very well financially, but everybody's a bit of a hypocrite.
From a musical point of view, there's a lot of fanfare horns and there's some time signature changes. And I was just thinking, Paul McCartney must have been listening to the Kinks because, We're So Sorry, Uncle Albert. Um,
Hmm.
those sudden time signature changes and it goes
Oh
into a
yeah, the
little bit of
movements.
musical hall. You can't tell me that Macca didn't listen to a bit of the Kinks.
Oh, they 100% all listened to each other. I'm very convinced that all those 60s bands, they all were keeping track of what one another were doing. I mean, like speaking of like concept albums from right around this time, I mean, you had SF Sorrow by the Pretty Things. I think that would be a great album to talk about on this show. I'd be happy to come back to talk about that one because that one's really good. Definitely not the best mood to lift people's spirits up, but it definitely reflected the mood of 68 100% with all those assassinations and the Vietnam War. Trying to think what else. Like the other concept album from right around this time is the Lottie Dawes, The Happy Prince. That's the first concept album from the Southern Hemisphere.
New Zealand, I'm
Yes.
impressed. Well done.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
I did my
I I,
homework.
I like the lad he does. Good
Yep.
Kevin Burridge. We will talk more. We will talk more. Some Mother's Son. This is a real anti-war song, isn't it? The
Oh, it's
heartbreaking.
one of the greatest ones. I'd say that one, and I think Butcher's Tale really show the mood of war and the realities of it in their sound. Like Butcher's Tale, I just love how the zombies did just I Can't Stop Shaking, and that makes you tear up almost. And then Some Other Son, I think that one, it's really sad as well, and I think it's among one of my favorite anti-war songs of all time. I'd also say another favorite anti-war song of mine is a bit later in music history, but it's by a Russian group called Kino, and it's the song's called Grupa Krovi, and I've been just obsessed with Kino for a while now, and that one's also great. Just wish me luck that I come home. I definitely see that mood. Just I want to come home. Like nobody really wants to be at war; they just want to be at home, and it's all just a rich person's game, and they're using poor people as their pawns. Like very rarely do rich people, be on the front lines during a war. They're always just, giving orders. It's the poor people that they're sending out as cannon fodder. I mean, rarely is a rich person in there. Rarely.
Yeah.
They're not
Yeah.
really putting their lives on the line. Very few did. I mean, the only situation of a rich person that I could think of that did put his life on the line would be John F. Kennedy during the PT 109, like the whole thing with the Japanese ship, and then he rescued his crewmates. That's the only like rich person I can think of that did that.
Mm. Yeah, well, it's definitely a topic that's been covered by many artists, but this has got
Fortunate
such,
son,
yeah,
CCR, yep.
absolutely. This has got such an emotional sweep to it, and I love the harmonies. It's kind of got this haunting but forceful feel to it. I've got to put a shout out for the drumming of Mick Avery. He sounds like Ringo Starr on steroids. He does these little simple fills, but it's sort of very powerful and it really drives the band. This is a great song. It's a wonderful anti-war song. The next one is Drivin'. This is kind of quirky and it's got a bit of a cheeky feel to it. What do you think of this song?
I love how it just changes mood. It's like, okay, parkour, let's move on to something that
Yeah.
just sounds goofy and silly and just, I guess, forget about the war. And I guess it's maybe kind of like the mood of the 60s. Okay, there's all this death and destruction all around you, but yeah, let's go sing cheesy, happy songs and that's kind of it. Like people are always looking for escapism, even in times of war, even in times of, trouble. I mean, people find ways to just live, and I think that song just shows that mood.
Ray Davies was saying he was like simulating a typical drive between London and the country and trying to replicate the sounds of going up the hills and down and around. And I think he kind of nails it. But there's a little bit of social observation in there, but it's just got a nice whimsical feel. Do you like the song listing in this album? Because you're saying there's contrasting. I mean, Some Mother's Son is such a devastating
Hmm.
anti-war song, and then you go into something whimsical. Do you think it's jarring, or it's a nice palate cleanser that you need a little bit of
It's
lightness?
it's jarring, but I think that's what I like is things that are a bit strange, and I think it's just
Mm,
meme worthy. And I'm just somebody who really appreciates memes and meme culture. I mean, I
yep.
on Instagram, a few years ago, I just make so many memes about the Kinks. So yeah, that was definitely one meme was just okay, crying, crying, some other side, and then all of a sudden, okay, happy. We're talking about driving, woo.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the joy about this album, because it takes you from one emotion to the other. It pulls you in all different
And maybe
directions.
it's a reflection of Ray's just emotional instability, because that's something he was really known for in those days was he had bipolar, and I think part of it definitely came from chronic pain issues that he had since a young age. He has scoliosis, so that obviously causes a lot of pain. So I can imagine, yup, that really gets to you emotionally. And speaking from my own perspective of having had chronic pain in the past, yeah, that definitely does get to you mentally, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Brainwashed, when that starts off, that initial riff, it kind of reminds me of Treat Her Right, that song by Rayhead and the Traits. And then it goes into a very 60s groove, like it kind of swings. What do you think of this song?
I think it's like proto-punk. I think this is probably their most proto-punk song on the album, and I do like the anti-authoritarianism in there and just the class consciousness of, you know, it does it's like a kind of a preview of what Shangri-La is going to be all about. You've reached your top and you can't get any higher. And it's just these people kind of seeing just the temporarily embarrassed millionaire phenomenon. I definitely see that it does talk about that. People thinking one day I'll get to the top, and that's why they support oppressing people is because they don't see themselves as one of those people. They just see a divide, and it's just the typical divide and conquer strategy that has been always used by the elites since, colonization.
I think Ray's saying, be a free thinker, don't follow the mob. So that's what he's saying in this the lyrics. Everyone should be an individual and have their own views. Just don't follow the mob. From a musicology point of view, it's very percussive. I like how you said about the punk aspect to it, and I love how the guitar follows the melody. And the Kinks use a lot of horns in this album. I love it. It sort of really gives it a lot of extra texture. And I don't know, maybe they were following what the Beatles were doing. A lot of it's very fanfare type of horns, but the horns in this
Right around
song are
that time, you
really,
did have the horn groups starting. So you had like Tower of Power and stuff like that starting off. So yeah,
yeah,
music was going in that direction of having horns and rock and roll. I think, yeah, definitely R&B just being mixed in with rock and roll. You had that kind of psychedelic soul is what they would call it. Yeah,
yeah. But
definitely. It had that sort of stuff.
but I think with 1967 with Penny Lane, with the horn
Mhm.
section and the sort of George Martin introducing different instruments, I'm sure that Davies was thinking, oh, okay, I'll bring that into my world, but I'll put it through my prism, through how I
Mhm.
hear things. So that
I think
that's
it's
the
just
wonderful thing
higher
about
budgets.
I think that's the wonderful thing about the 60s. And I know why you probably like classic rock, because they were creating their own rules. Who was the influence of these bands before? Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis,
Elvis.
Richard, Elvis. So this generation were basically experimenting and creating their own rules. And that's it's wonderful. And I just think this album is so experimental. It's just got a such broad palette. Australia. I think as an
All
Australian,
right.
I think this is hilarious. It's so tongue in cheek. Um, so, just to give you a little bit of background, there was a big push in England in the 60s and the late 50s for the English to immigrate to Australia, the land of plenty, come down under. And this, the lyrics cheekily follows that sort of theme. To me, it's this sort of song is like having a sing along around the piano, on a Sunday afternoon with the family. What do you think of this song?
I like this one a lot. I definitely think he isn't celebrating moving to Australia because, no place is perfect. No country is perfect. There's definitely problems in every country. Like
But
it's kind
he's
of like
playing
like
off that. He's playing off that
yeah.
that sort of that theme, but with the
Yeah.
dark underbelly. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely I've been to Australia twice, so that's where I honeymooned, and then I went again a year later for a conference that my husband went to, and then we got to visit some of his family. So that phenomenon definitely still continues with the Irish and the English moving over for better pay, better opportunities, or so they think, because now, I mean, those opportunities are kind of drying up. I've seen people of my generation complaining about property costs there, and very much it does remind me of Canada. It does remind me a lot of Canada, but warmer. And
Well, what's the temperature over there at the moment? Just saying.
freezing.
I'm wearing shorts. You're rugging up. So anyway, that's
Yeah.
that's that's the seasons. One thing I do like about this song, Angie, is that it switches over halfway and it goes into this big jam session. They're just jamming it up.
That's
And
my favorite bit.
I know that's what you were talking about earlier in the show. And they're just, the song breathes. It's like it doesn't want to finish and they're just ripping it up.
You don't think of them as a
No,
jam band, but I
no.
love that they showed that they are capable of doing that. And I'm curious what they would have done with it live. I mean, obviously, what kind of fan am I if I'm not listening to the live stuff from that time? But yeah, I'd
Yeah,
be wondering what would it have been like to see them tour this album, and then would they have gone even longer with the jams? I would have loved to have seen that because,
yeah.
that would be cool to see another sibling group doing jams like that. Like, I love the Allman Brothers. That's another sibling group that I absolutely adore. I love their jams. Those are so much fun.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about the '60s where they could experiment in song structures. Like, "Hey Jude," let's face it, it's a big outro, isn't it? Nah,
Hmm.
nah, nah. It just goes on and on and on, and they're just reinventing the rules. Were you surprised when you listen to this song and you think, "Oh, it's a jaunty little sing along," and then switches over and it goes into this jam session?
Yeah.
It's surprising, isn't it?
I like that this album's full of surprises. I
It
like that. I like
is.
these
It
plot
is.
twists. It's kind of like watching a TV show that just has such good writing. And originally, this album was supposed to be the plot of a mini series or a movie, a TV movie, I think. And I would have loved to have seen this become, a movie and people enjoyed it. Like, that's the thing I think the Kinks were missing out on. And that's probably why they weren't seen as like the same as the Beatles or the Stones or the Who, is because they didn't have any movies, really. They didn't have a Kinks movie.
Mm,
And I would have loved to have seen a movie of them. And I talk about
yeah.
it in my book. Ray and Dave Davis were the Curry twins' first choice to play them in the movie. And then all of a sudden they were like, yeah, we don't want to do this because we don't want to glorify crime. And then they regretted it because they were like,
Yeah.
we could have made a lot of money being in this movie because there's
Yeah.
just so much money in movies. And I think some rock stars don't realize that.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on, but it's not to say that Ray Davies didn't have ambition because there's a lot of ambition in this particular album.
I think it was just Dave kind of holding him back because it was just safer to tour because everybody would be making money. Well, if Ray just goes off and does all these solo projects, he's the one making the money. I see that sort of same dynamic with The Who and Pete Townsend and, the rest of the band, they didn't have as many songwriting credits as Pete Townsend did. So they were all desperate for the money from touring while Pete was like, I want to go do all these other projects. And then the rest of The Who are like, yeah, but we need to tour. We need money.
Yeah, absolutely. Next song is probably my favorite, Shangri-La. What do you think of this song?
Oh, yes. This one, as soon as I moved to England, I really understood this one on a deeper level, even more so. Definitely, like, there's this one quote from, like, I don't know if she's a journalist or a writer, but it was just kind of like how people leave the house empty all day to be at work. And they need that job so they can keep up their house and keep the car. And they're driving a car that they're still making payments on from their job. And then they're, you know, wearing clothes that they need for work, and it's just this absurdity of capitalism and this rat race. It's definitely the absurdity of the rat race is definitely talked about in this, and it kind of makes me think of this Netflix show called F is for Family that was created by Bill Burr, who is famously a Kinks fan. And yeah, I can definitely see similarities between Arthur Morgan and Frank Murphy in that show. 100%. I definitely see that. Just he had big ambitions of being like a pilot or something. Like Frank Murphy wanted to be a pilot, but then he got his wife pregnant, and then he had to just take a more realistic job and, just focus on the here and now. And I think that's the thing with, being working class is just it's expensive to be that. You miss out on so many opportunities. And yeah, just Shangri-La, it's just such a good song. And yeah, I mean, unironically, I'm going to say everybody needs their Shangri-La. Unironically, yes. But yeah, it's just really sad how, in my generation, so many people are just never going to be able to just own property. It's just going to be called generation rent. It's just sad.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. It is certainly tough. There should have been a hit, and
Oh yeah.
just so many different movements, so inventive. Like it starts off with a delicate acoustic guitar line, and then you got Ray Davies' voice, which is a little fragile, kind of gentle, and then it builds up. And I love it. It builds up, and you've got the fanfare with the horns, a little bit of music hall, and those acoustic guitar power chords, and the powerful drumming of Mick on the drums. It just propels it along. So it's just so rich. There's just so much happening in this song. A song of
I
movement.
think Dave Davis has said that's his favorite Kinks song of all of them and it's just so good. I think he said of Ray that he says it better than any politician.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue to Mr. Churchill Says. This is
Oh
a little
yeah.
bit of revisionist looking back. You know, is Churchill a hero or maybe not? What do you think of this one?
Yeah.
Again, Ray Davies is in the full character voice. What do you think of this song?
I definitely think there's a lot of sarcasm and it's interesting like when somebody has such a complicated legacy like that, but I think that's true of so many historical figures. Like when you really look into them, it's kind of like, okay, at first you're like, oh, the pop culture history of them, the Disney-fied version of them. Oh, they were a hero. But then you look at the realities and you're like, wait a minute. They did all of this. So like, yeah, if you ask Indian people what they think of Churchill, they'll tell you awful things. You ask Irish people what
Imperialism.
they think, they'll tell you horrible things. And then English people, it's interesting just how patriotic a lot of people here are. And I don't think patriotism is bad. Ray Davis isn't against patriotism. I don't think he is. I think he's just against it when it's hateful.
Mm. This is a three-part epic. This would probably be the most psychedelic of all the songs, wouldn't you, on
Oh
this
yeah.
album?
Just the instrumental jam, the sirens going off, like the air raid sirens going off, and then it goes into this guitar riff that is from Wake Up Little Susie. That's the Everly Brothers connection. When I heard that, I was like, okay, what song? This sounds familiar. And I was like, it's Wake Up Little Susie by the Everly Brothers that they're borrowing, and it's just brilliantly done. I think it's just such a great one because it's appropriate because, when the air raid sirens go off, wake up, you need to, get out and you need to go into the shelter and hide.
Yeah.
And the city I live in was very much affected by bombing. So I live in Coventry, and it's just famously known as a city that had to rebuild so much after the war. So a lot of the city is very brutalist and kind of, it's just so demoralizing because, the beauty of the city, it originally looked like any other Warwickshire kind of town. It had all these kinds of medieval looking buildings, and then the Nazis just destroyed it all. They destroyed this beautiful old cathedral. And yeah, the ruins of that cathedral are still up. And there was another cathedral actually in Liverpool that was similarly in ruins as well. You can actually go and visit both of those cathedrals. It's just there's interesting photography in that, but it's just so sad, what war does. Like, there's no true winners in a war at the end of the day. That's what I think. There's just no winner.
Yeah.
Each side loses people. There's
Yeah.
destruction of everything.
Yep. I've seen that cathedral in Liverpool. That's yeah, it's devastating to see what happened in World War Two. But like this song is about the struggle of war on English folk, and even
Hmm.
the impact on the babies of the post-war
I
babies.
think
It's got
Ray
such an impact.
Davis I think when he was a baby, he was in the kitchen just in a baby, like a baby carrier. And then one of his sisters decided to just move him out of there. And then all of a sudden, a bomb landed in their backyard or something like that. And the window just exploded and just shattered. And thankfully, he wasn't in there because he would have died.
Sliding doors. She's bought a hat like Princess Marina. What do you think of this one?
This one, I think, is that's their anti-consumerist song. This is where they talk about just aspirations and just it kind of talks about influencers before influencers, and royalty were influencers before influencers. These guys, people would try to emulate them because, hey, this is the epitome of class. These people, they were treated like historically like gods. Like they were given this, authority to rule by gods. And people wanted to dress like them. And I guess people think that, oh, if I dress like them, I'm going to be like them. But the reality is, these rich people know what you are and they know where you went to school. Class isn't just about what you wear, it's about where you were educated, it's about where you holiday, it's about what properties you own, what investments you have. It's just kind of a surface level, looking rich. And maybe could it be like a commentary on the nouveau riche? I think about the nouveau riche as well and just that focus on materialism, definitely.
Musicology, do you think it's a little bit too music hall on the wrong side of the ledger? To me, it's a little bit zany for my taste.
Yeah, I definitely think that's where it is weak, but the message is there. I like the message. Definitely, I think the later parts of the album are a bit weaker,
Yeah.
but musically, but I still think it's pretty good. It's just
Yeah.
like it's weak for the Kinks and even their worst stuff. Although I don't like their mid 70s stuff as much, but that's another story. But like their worst stuff, I think is still better than a lot of people's best stuff.
So you forgive it because of the lyrics are strong, but the music
Yeah,
side
I
of
think
it,
the message.
yeah. To me, I can hear a kazoo, and that's sort of that the dial goes on the wrong side of the ledger. So this is probably the weakest track
Yeah, I
for my
think there's definitely
taste.
similarities sound-wise between this and like what Thunderclap Newman were doing. I recently reviewed a book that was a biography of Thunderclap Newman, and it does talk about like how on some of the songs they do have this kind of old music hall kind of kazoo sort of stuff going on, and I'm like, huh, this was being made right around the same time as Thunderclap Newman were recording stuff, so that was something
Yeah,
to that definitely I just
yeah.
made that connection right now.
The next song is "Young and Innocent Days." What do you think of this one?
This one I'm a little less familiar with, but yeah, I definitely think it's an okay song. I don't think it's one of the ones that is most memorable. Definitely, it's not one of their most memorable ones.
Yeah. To me, lyrically, it's looking back in time. It's looking at lost innocence, the time in the past. The lyrics go, I look back at the way I used to look at life. Soft white dreams were sugar coated outside. So I think he's being very reflective. And I think this song paves the way for the last couple of tracks. You know how there are certain tracks, album tracks, what I call transitional album tracks, where it's
Hmm.
sort of like a pathway to what's going to happen. So we do go to the next tracks on the album, and that is Nothing to Say. Starts off with a bit of a rollicking piano line. I say a la Paul McCartney, and then goes into this groovy up-tempo melody. What do you think of this one?
I like this one better than the last one. Yeah, it still
Yeah.
continues on with the same themes of like class and
This one talks about alienation within a family. And I
mm,
feel, and sometimes you think families can be close units, but when you peel away the surface, they're not. And I think this is very biting. It talks about how families, are going in their separate ways. Maybe he's talking about his family. you know,
oh yeah, he had a
maybe it's a
sibling that
bit of
moved to
a
Australia.
maybe it's a little bit more of a family thing. This one, to me, Angie, is the most Blur sounding song.
Hmm.
I think this. I could imagine this on any of those early Blur albums. I can
Yep.
see Damon
Yeah.
Albarn is really. He's been listening to Arthur a hell of a lot.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's
But
got
yeah, I
those.
think maybe it's a reference to Ray and Dave's difficult relationship because I think they did live separately at some points as growing up because Ray would sometimes live with his sister.
Yeah,
And then Dave being the baby of the family, I think that just took away all the attention from Ray. So I think maybe sometimes there is a bit of resentment there. I know that sometimes with older siblings, they get resentful of their younger siblings and getting all the attention. I know I definitely felt that sometimes with my little brother.
yeah. Are they together, or are the Kinks like permanently defunct? Because there was a rumor that they
They
may
claim
get
that,
back
oh my gosh,
together and they might do something.
they claim that they're going to reunite. I think it's just something that they do whenever they're going to sell something new or they're going to sell another greatest hits or, something else
Yeah.
like that. They're just like, okay, we're going to claim that we're reuniting again, but I don't ever see that ever happening. They are never going to play anything ever again, given Dave had a stroke, Ray Davis was shot in the leg. That all happened in the same year, 2004.
Mm,
And then Pete Quaife, obviously, they can't do anything with the original, all original people because Pete Quaife died in 2010. And this is actually the first album without Pete Quaife. This was with John Dalton on bass, which he's very good. Like I like John Dalton, and I think what's funny is he actually kind of does look like Paul McCartney. Kind of. It's
yeah.
very strange.
Well, John Dalton was there for a considerable period of time. He was there for a long stretch. So
And there was a
people,
kind of a curse in the Kinks where all the bassists seemed to go back to day jobs. That's one of the things that I noticed because Pete Quaife went back to a day job and so did John Dalton. They both did. And I think they just never, well, Pete Quaife definitely did not re-enter the music industry, while John Dalton would just go with the cast-off Kinks.
heavily traumatized, they had to go back to working life.
That's just
They
crazy.
couldn't handle the bickering. So
I mean, being famous definitely does take a toll on you, and I definitely think maybe sometimes you think, well, if the money's not very good, it definitely isn't worth it then. Like, okay, you're a rock star, but what do you have to show for it? And
yeah,
with 9 to 5 jobs, at least there is some stability, or at least there was definitely at that time, like in the 70s. Sure, I think there was a bit more stability with that than there is today. I mean, everything's just so temporary today. Everything's precarious no matter where you are.
you'd really have to decompress, wouldn't you? Because
Yeah.
you go into this higher, rarefied air of adulation and the screaming. And like I watched on Disney Channel a documentary recently on the Beatles and the famous concert in 1963 on the Ed Sullivan Show or 64. And
Yeah, it was 64. Yep.
yeah, and they were basically trapped in their hotel room. They couldn't,
Oh yeah.
they
I
didn't
was
have fun.
recently I recently reviewed the Cheap Trick biography, American Standard, and yeah, Cheap Trick were very much the same way, especially in Japan. They couldn't even so much as open the curtains of their hotel room because all the girls would be screaming and running across the street trying to get into the hotel.
So what was Japan like? Oh well, the hotel was fine. Good hotel food. I mean, you're literally trapped. So the Beatles were just trapped. But
Fame
look,
is like a prison.
it is. So we're going off track here, but just sort of saying that the
Yeah.
adulation and the rarefied air of being in the Kinks and then going back to a 9 to 5 job, it's a little bit of a decompress, isn't it? Take a while to get used to.
It's humbling.
It is, but I don't know. And that's interesting. Food for thought. Last song on the album, and if you get this special super duper edition, there's all bonus tracks. We won't go into that, but folks, check it out. There's all sorts of B-sides and demos and etc. etc. But the last
Good
song is
stuff.
Arthur. It's a nice little finish. It's got kind of a country feel to it because there is some country and folk elements to
Yeah.
this album as well, isn't there?
Like a prediction of the Muswell Hillbillies album, I'd almost say. Yeah. And that's only a
Yeah.
couple albums away. So, yeah, I like this one. And it does kind of just talk about his aspirations and how he wanted all this stuff. But then I definitely get this whole George Carlin message of it's a big club and you're not in it, Arthur.
Yeah, and it sort of reprises all the themes, the working class themes, and it's kind of a summary of all the different storylines that have preceded this particular song. So, do you think it nicely ties up the album?
Yes, definitely. I definitely think it's a good summary. And I think ending on just the main character is a good way to end the album for sure.
All right, well there you go. We've covered the album. Why do you think it flopped? What's your feel? Do you think there's no like Victoria is a very catchy song that should have hit a bit of fire, but do you think maybe it just doesn't have a You Really Got
I
Me, a
think
Lola or Waterloo Sunset?
I think what it is just it's all comes down to the US ban. The Kinks were the only, well, they weren't the only band really to get a ban from the US. The Rolling Stones also got a ban, but I think the Rolling Stones had much better marketing. Well, the Kinks were signed to Pi Records, and Pi Records, Pete Quaife said they were not very good at marketing. And it's hard to market, overseas when you can't play overseas. And the Kinks never, they couldn't play in America at the peak of their creativity. But I think it's for those same reasons that this album is very good. Because if they went to America and they were playing Woodstock, they were playing Monterey, they were touring all over the US, I think the US would have definitely influenced more of their sound. I mean, there's already always going to be some American influence. But I think I'm glad that they did something for, that was very British themed. And I think it's great for the Anglophiles. And I think it is a good education on England for those who aren't from England. I definitely think so.
Yeah,
Overall, I think it's really
mm,
good. And I think some of the anti-establishment themes maybe made it flop because, well, yeah, sure, McCarthyism was over. I think there's still definitely that Red Scare that was going on. I mean, it's still the Cold War. The Red Scare, probably that sort of stuff didn't help. And I think if you were too vocally socialist, that definitely could ruin your career.
yeah. But folks, seriously, if you want to hear bands like Blur, The Jam, The Clash, Suede, Jarvis Cocker, and Pulp, all comes back to the Kinks, and maybe that album. It's To me, it sounds fresh, even though you can tell it's in '69 and it's got some musicology that's very particular of that time. It To me, it sounds very contemporary and fresh, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's great. Like, I definitely think, it's a great example of why the best art doesn't have an expiry date. It's just good whenever.
Classic rock does not have an expiry date, and that's why you dig classic rock.
Yes.
Absolutely. Any final words on the album for the folks? And maybe tell the folks some other Kinks albums if they like this one.
Yes. This is always
Recommendation?
one I recommend to new listeners to the Kinks. I'd also recommend Village Green. Village Green is also excellent. Something Else by the Kinks is also really good. Something Else is the one that has Waterloo Sunset and David Watts, both great songs. I'd also recommend Lola versus Power Man. I definitely think that's a very good album as well. But yeah, definitely their work up until like the early 70s is just all amazing. I definitely think that is just a top tier discography. I think the Kinks are a band that definitely had a similar trajectory to the Who in that, they had a very strong start and then it kind of just fell off, but their greatest stuff is just so great. And yeah, definitely, the Kinks shouldn't just be relegated as a footnote or just as a sidebar. They're definitely I'd call them a main character in the 60s, definitely.
I think they're one of the big four, so they've got to be spoken
Yep.
about in those other three.
And
Angie
I
Moon,
talk about them in my book. So I do talk about them in two
absolutely.
chapters. So chapter 2 talks about their encounter with John Wayne Gacy, and chapter 3 talks about the Cray twins. So if you want to learn about like London's gangsters and then one of the most how a rock band ran into one of the most notorious serial killers in America, yeah, get my book. It's on my website. You can get it signed by my cat. My cat walked in a bit, so yeah, that's who will be signing it if you want it signed by my cat. I'll also sign it too, and yeah, it's also available on a lot of book selling shops. Just go to my website, crazyonclassicrock.com, and yeah,
I
don't
will
miss out.
I will share the
Cheers.
link and I'll put your website. So Angie, wonderful to have you on the show. I'll have you back. We'll talk about something else. We'll come up with
Awesome.
something. Folks, tell us what you think of this Kinks album, your favorite Kinks song, favorite Kinks album. We love reading your comments. Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. But one thing's for sure, me and Angie, you'll see us on the channel doing more in 2025. All the best, Dan. Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.